Thank you, Madam Chair, fellow panellists, and good to be on the panel today. I've had an interest in HIV issues for a very long time, going back to when I was a Minister of Health in my own country in 1989-90, and part of the early part of the response, and then coming to UNDP, I found it was also a very significant player in the response, not least because it's a member of the family of UN AIDS co-sponsors and works closely with UN AIDS and other agencies involved in the response, and also a very close partner of the Global Fund. And with the Global Fund, we have been doing some quite remarkable work on effective responses around the world. So my topic today is to talk about HIV and the post-2015 development agenda. Where's it going beyond the MDGs? I think in a well-informed audience like this, people are relatively familiar with the process which is being followed on defining the new global agenda post-2015. Last year, there was huge public outreach facilitated by the UN Development System to hear directly from the world's peoples what they wanted to see prioritised in the new agenda. And it seems that by now, rather more than 3 million people have had a say, many of them, of course, online through the My World survey, but many also through national consultations, which took place in close to 100 countries, and where we worked hard to get very, very wide outreach to the most marginalised populations and groups within countries. As our chair has just said, a key part of the global public response has been don't give up on the MDGs. There is unfinished business. There's unfinished business on HIV and MDG 6, and there's unfinished business on a number of the other goals and targets. From around the end of the first quarter last year, the UN General Assembly Open Working Group on the Sustainable Development Goals started meeting to look at writing a report on what should be in the new agenda. And it has just finished its work. I understand there was a very late night at the weekend when the final report was brokered through. And what we can say from the wording on HIV is that it is suggesting a significant lift in ambition on where the world should be aiming to be on HIV. The MDG target talked about halting and reversing the epidemic. This proposed target from the General Assembly's Open Working Group is talking about ending the epidemic by 2030. Then when you look elsewhere in the document that was negotiated finally by Saturday night, there are some very important other targets which relate very directly to the HIV response. For example, on ensuring universal access to sexual and reproductive health, to ending all forms of discrimination and all forms of violence against women and girls, and ensuring that all learners in our education systems actually are educated on human rights, gender equality, and promotion of a culture of peace and non-violence. So these new SDGs, when finalised, will, like the MDGs, have very important links across the body of goals and targets. We know, for example, that HIV can trap families and communities and whole countries in poverty. If the goal of the new SDGs is to eradicate poverty, then the end of the HIV epidemic is going to be a very important component of that. But of course, AIDS is also increasingly a disease of inequalities and exclusion. So if the SDGs are targeting gender inequality and all forms of discrimination and are promoting a culture of peace and non-violence, that too is very positive for ending the epidemic. The next step in the process will be for the UN Secretary-General to go to the General Assembly with what's been called a synthesis report on the deliberations so far. A synthesis report tries to bring things together. In the Open Working Group report just finalised, there are 17 focus areas. The issue will be, can the Secretary-General focus that a little more? And then negotiations on the SDGs are expected to begin between the member states of the United Nations later this year. There will be a very important conference on financing for development held in Addis Ababa in July next year. And then the new development agenda is scheduled to be agreed by world leaders coming to the high-level week at the General Assembly in September 2015. What is critical for the AIDS response is not to lose any of the momentum which has been generated by MDG 6 and all the partnerships and funding which was mobilised around that. The end of the AIDS epidemic will come because of a wide range of actions being taken by a wide range of stakeholders. An SDG which is targeting the end of the epidemic and encouraging action across many sectors working collaboratively, I think can keep up the momentum which was driven by MDG 6. At UNDP, we will continue to advocate for the social determinants of HIV to be addressed, including through the repeal of punitive laws and policies. In a way, this has become our signature tune to call for the end of punitive laws and policies as the single most cost-effective thing that can be done to address the marginalisation, exclusion and stigma so often driving the epidemic. The Global Commission on HIV and the Law, which we convened, made a finding that changes in the law and policy, combined with other interventions, could have the effect of lowering new adult HIV infections globally to an estimated 1.2 million by 2031, down from an estimated 2.1 million, almost double, by that date, forecast under a business-as-usual scenario. But the accelerated effort will require much stronger adherence to human rights principles and the responses, and actions to promote access to health for all, particularly among key populations, including men who have sex with men, sex workers, transgender people, and people who are using drugs. While there are obviously some subtleties and some caveats around what is meant by ending AIDS, let us be clear that it shouldn't mean success being defined in terms of a background epidemic which has moved just far enough into the shadows so that many people no longer notice or care. Nor should it mean protection of the general population from infection while the epidemic rages unchecked among the most vulnerable and excluded people in our societies. Ending the AIDS epidemic has to mean ending it equitably and with dignity for all. So how do we achieve this? Well, certainly the evidence is suggesting that countries which have been successful in curbing disparities in health have focused public spending on the universal provision of services, while also ensuring that all groups can actually access them. And this can be achieved even with limited resources. Let's note the example of Thailand, which has achieved universal health coverage by spending rather less than the recommended WHO benchmark by 2040 of 5% of GDP on health. But what we also know is that improving health coverage and services is just one factor amongst the many determinants of health and health inequities. The stark truth is that inequities in health continue even in countries with many decades of experience in universal health coverage. So we will need investments across the areas being targeted by the SDGs on social protection, on education, on advancing gender equality, and on law reform in order to have the greatest impact on HIV outcomes. So, in closing, let me underline that the obstacles to ending the epidemic are as much social, political and legal as they ever are financial and technical. A strong target in the post-2015 development agenda will help raise aspirations and generate the momentum we need to end the epidemic. We do need very strong political will from governments, which are ultimately responsible for the national HIV responses. We need continuing and increased support from the international community and a commitment to human rights. We need to end the epidemic, improved monitoring and accountability mechanisms. We need investments in all aspects of the response. And none of this can be achieved without strengthened partnerships with civil society, affected populations and communities. I think our responsibility as development practitioners, as civil society, as the international community, is to stand by the countries and the most affected people of the world to make the end of the epidemic a reality. That's where the SDG discussion is going, and I urge you all to keep in touch with your governments and their representatives who will be negotiating at the United Nations over the course of the next 14 months or so that we get an agenda which maintains the momentum achieved under MDG 6 and aims to achieve a lot more. Thank you.